Cheers. How's everyone doing today? That's good. That's good. It's nice to see everyone out. My name is Dan J. Broyld. I'm a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. I am local. I am from Rochester, New York, born and raised. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The flower city. I was born to the 1904, raised in Gates, and so it's always nice to be home. I always feel like a visitor or a tourist when I come back to Rochester. The city is changing so much. The inner loop, I tried to go around the inner loop. That didn't quite work out the way I thought it was going to work out. So there's always something new, right? In Rochester that's happening, which is great. So again, I'm here today to give a concise talk on my book, Borderland Blacks. I only have 3 copies that I can sell today, but it is available online at Barnes and Nobles. And sometimes I already see people eyeing me like, oh, one of those 3 is mine. And so we could talk about that after, but it is available online readily, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, etc. And so within my discussion this afternoon, there are 2 primary objectives. I will first begin by giving a mini intellectual biography in order to explain the early foundations of my work on Rochester and St. Catherine's. And secondly, I will offer a discussion of my work to include an explanation of my findings, sources used, in the historiographical relevance of the study. So, and so here's the book. Before, when I gave this presentation, it was, it was coming soon, but now it's out, so you can order it again. But what I want to start with is the mini intellectual biography, or simply how did I come up with the study? First of all, I grew up in Rochester, New York, and growing up some 80 miles from the American-Canadian borderland, I commonly crossed the international lines as a youngster. In those times, no passport was needed to cross the international lines. Only a valid driver's license or birth certificate was needed. This made the passage from Rochester to St. Catherine's or to Canada seamless. My family traveled to Canada so much when I was a youngster that I remember asking my mom if I was American or Canadian because I had no idea. She responded by telling me that I was indeed an American, but with Canadian influences because of my proximity to the border, right? So my upbringing clearly demonstrated to me that my American experience was somehow different from my national counterparts based on my proximity to Canada. However, this transnational perspective of Rochester, to my disappointment, was not reflected in the historiography of the city. In the past, historians have dealt with Rochester as a single localized entity, housed within the liberal zone of the burnt-over district, but not by way of a comprehensive borderland framework. This was the problem that prompted me to pick this subject to investigate. And so, academically, that explains the Rochester side of things. The other city that I deal with in this study is St. Catherine's. So academically, I was reintroduced to St. Catherine's by rereading Frederick Douglass's last autobiography entitled The Life and Time of Frederick Douglass, published in 1881, revised in 1892, just before his death in 1895. And it reads, the Underground Railroad had many branches, but the one with which I was connected to had its main stations in Baltimore, Wellington, Philadelphia, New York City, Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and St. Catherine's. J.P. Morris and myself received and dispatched passengers from Rochester to Canada, where they were received by Reverend Hiram Wilson. When a party arrived in Rochester, it was the business of Mr. Morris and myself to raise funds to pay their passage to St. Catherine's. So what I learned from this passage by Frederick Douglass is that, number one, J.P. Morris was a local barber that used to help Frederick Douglass transport fugitives to Canada. But also Hiram Wilson was an individual that Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Amy and Isaac Post, all identified as wanting to get their fugitives to in St. Catherine's if they were not rushed, right? And so ideally, this is who they wanted to get their fugitives to. And so what the study does is looks at Rochester and St. Catherine's, the last two stops on this Niagara Underground Railroad route, to really kind of deconstruct what was going on. And so this is what the route looked like, right? And so the story that is best known of Rochester in St. Catherine's and of the Underground Railroad is kind of a one-way flow from America to Canada. But what I do in my study is I show that the door of the border swung open in both directions, right? So some people went to Canada first, and then they came to Rochester, or they were in Rochester, and then they went to St. Catherine's. And the border is kind of working with a two-way flow, with ebbs and flows, if you will. Looking at some of the historiography or things that have been written on Rochester, you see that Eric Foner wrote a book that concentrates primarily on New York City, and it also concentrates on Syracuse and on Albany, right? And so what I wanted to do with my work is kind of finish out the story of how fugitives got to Canada. And so he looks at a record called The Record of the Fugitives by this guy, Sidney Howard Gay. And this was a newly discovered piece of historical documentation that was found in the 2000s at Columbia University. And so what he's doing in this book is telling about what, the people that are in the Record of Fugitives. But Sidney Howard Gay, he never talked about Rochester in this narrative. And so Douglass and Rochester were left out of this picture. And so there's like this gap between Syracuse and then he would say people just got to Canada. I'm like, no, you got to tell the rest of the story, right? What's going on here? But what we'll find out is that there was some philosophical differences that Sidney Howard Gay had with Frederick Douglass. He did not, mention Frederick Douglass or Rochester because of these differences. Generally, there was a big rift in the abolitionist movement, and it was over the Constitution and the political process. In New England, Garrison and other New Englanders, they actually burned the Constitution. They just said not to vote, not to use the political process. Where in Rochester, they were saying, if the Constitution and the political process helps us to eliminate slavery, we'll use it, right? We'll use any means, right? And so that's why he doesn't mention Frederick Douglass. And so what I do in my work is I extend, and my work is a continuum of what Eric Foner has done. So he talked about New York City, he talked about Syracuse, but he does not talk about Rochester, Buffalo, and St. Catherine's, right? And so I kind of finished the narrative of what's going on. Again, in Sidney Howard Gay's narrative, he would say like people, from Syracuse, they just got to Canada. It's like that doesn't just magically happen. They're using some cities, right? And so what I do is kind of finish out the narrative by talking about Rochester and St. Catherine's. The other thing about Rochester is that Rochester is considered part of the burnt-over district. And so this really kind of categorizes Rochester in these very nationalistic terms. It's called the burnt-over district because of the religious revitalization movements, if you will, that's happening in Western New York. You have the Mormons that were established in Western New York. The Mormons of Latter-day Saints establishes churches under Joseph Smith. The Millerites, which I find really interesting because they said the second coming was going to happen on October 22nd, 1844. I always ask what happened on October 23rd when he didn't come back. Who's a Millerite now, right? And so, and then the Shakers is a religious sect that died out because members were forbidden to have sex with one another, right? And this is all happening in Western New York. You have the Fox sisters communicating with the dead, the Oneida community that believes in, communal marriages. And so in one area of Western New York that is surrounded by Rochester, and Rochester is a part of this, you have a group of people that are taking on more than one wife, right? The Mormons. You have the Shakers that are not having sex at all. And then you basically have an orgy, like literally, with the Oneida community. I mean, it's like, the area that Rochester is in. And then too, you also have the abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, and the temperance movement that's going on. I always say that Rochester is the most western part of the United States, right? And so even like the Mormons, they keep moving west and they wind up in Salt Lake City because they want to be on the fringes of society. They don't, the establishment is on the East Coast, right, on the Atlantic coast, right? And so they keep moving west because they want to be on the fringes. And so what Rochester was a part of is like literally California's free love before California. That's what it is. It's on the fringes, if you will, of society. And you can see that Rochester is in the middle of all of this, all of these religious movements, right? The other thing that's happening is you have the beginning of an industrial revolution before the Civil War. And so, things are developing on the East Coast. You have trains and things of that nature. And so people are kind of afraid of this. And so they go to these utopian communities in Western New York to kind of get back to the old, right? And get back to religion, right? It's very interesting what's happening in Western New York. And so a lot of the concentration, the historical concentration, is on these religious revitalization movements, right? But what I say is that, what makes Rochester so significant is its proximity to Canada, because those religious movements don't save Black people. They can go with the United community, they can go be Mormons, but that's not going to save them from a slave catcher. What's going to save them is British Canada. That's what will save them, right? And the Black people in Rochester recognize the British as a liberation force because of the American Revolution and also the War of 1812, where the United States is fighting the British, right? And the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And so there's more Black people that fought for the British and got free than fought for the Patriots, right? And so, we always talk about how, Black people fought in every war. Yeah, they did, but twice the number of people fought for the British side and got their freedom and got land in Canada. Right? And so the Black people recognize the British, they're not the best, but they are better than the Americans, if you will. Right? And so the thing that makes Rochester so important to Black people is its proximity to Canada, right? And if you think about it, when people come and visit you from out of town, right? They come to Rochester, New York. What do they want to see? They want to see the falls, right? And so they're coming from the south and they take us to the falls, right? And so you're in this international zone, right, where on the other side of the border is Canada, right? And that makes Rochester really a significant place because most other cities are more inland. They don't have that kind of connection to somewhere else. Also, this is an Atlantic world conversation because they're being controlled. British Canada is being controlled by the British, right? So it makes it an international story right now because the rules are coming from England. So it's really a dynamic space that we inhabit in Rochester, New York. So looking at Rochester, New York and St. Catharines, Ontario as being a part of the Niagara region, I categorize Rochester as being a part of the Niagara region. Generally, we just think of Buffalo and Niagara Falls as kind of being in the Niagara region, right? But I really say that Rochester is a part of this region as well. And I give really three basic reasons why that is. And it's because, Rochester has the northern flowing Genesee River. It also has the western flowing Erie Canal traveling right through the middle of it. It also has international bridges that are in the Niagara zone, and also this thing called the Niagara Escarpment, which you can see on the map, which I'll explain what that is in a little bit. But today, Rochester, New York is considered a part of the Finger Lakes. So you have to understand that regions change over time and space, right? Sometimes when I teach the Caribbean, I'll teach Florida and Louisiana as a part of the Caribbean because culturally they're that way. My mom's from Florida and she has like these kind of Caribbean things that she does. I'm like, what in the world is this? And so regions, you can kind of define them the way you want to define them. And I really look at Rochester as being a part of the Niagara region. The other great thing about Rochester is that Rochester is located in an ideal area for fugitive slaves. Buffalo and Niagara Falls are kind of too close to the border. And so a lot of slave catchers, they will congregate in the Buffalo Niagara Falls area because they understand this is our last chance to get those Black people before they go into Canada, right? But Rochester is kind of in this in-between area that is not too far from the border, but just far enough away from it, where Syracuse is just too far, and Syracuse doesn't have lake access to Canada, right? And so Rochester occupies this great space where it's just far enough not to be too dangerous, and it's not too close, but it's also not too far. It's perfectly placed, if you will, for these fugitive slaves to operate. This is why Frederick Douglass picked it. He knew it was like a perfectly placed space, if you will. And even if you look at the fugitives that were captured in Buffalo and the fugitives that were captured in Syracuse, no fugitives were ever taken from Rochester, New York. That's because of its placement. It's part of the you have to understand that geography has agency, right? There's certain things that you can't do in Rochester because of where it's located. Like I would like to go, to a nice beach today, or in December I would like to have one short, but it's Rochester, right? And the weather plays a factor, right? And so Rochester is perfectly placed for these fugitive, Blacks that are living in the city and to have access, if you will, to Canada. The other interesting thing about Rochester in this Niagara zone is the international overpasses. And you have the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge. You also have the Lewiston-Queenston Suspension Bridge as well. And so in 1848, they started to build suspension bridges over the Niagara River. And these are important because, Blacks not only can take a ship to Canada, now they can walk to Canada. In 1855, they added rail traffic, if you will, on the upper deck to this Niagara Falls suspension bridge. And so Blacks can take a train to Canada, they can literally walk over a bridge to Canada, or they can take a ship. That makes it internationally dynamic. The real reason why they started to build these bridges is because of Niagara Falls, right? The ships you will fall over the falls, right? And so you have to have other ways to get to Canada, right? The interesting thing about these bridges is that the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge in particular is that it was predicated around William Hamilton Merritt and then Charles Stewart as well, the engineer. So it's really a Rochester St. Catherine's duel that makes this bridge happen, right? And so Rochester and St. Catherine's are the key areas in this Niagara zone, right? You can see that these two individuals are the reason why this suspension bridge is built. I also want to look at Rochester and St. Catherine's from their commonalities and connections. I mentioned the Niagara escarpment. The Niagara escarpment is a scar in the earth that is made by glaciers. And so the escarpment looks like this throughout Western New York. That's the escarpment. And you can see that the escarpment starts right in the Rochester area. The thing that the escarpment makes is things like Niagara Falls, right? But it also makes in Rochester high falls and lower falls. That's the escarpment, right? And so if you look at Rochester, this is why I'm saying that Rochester is a part of the Niagara region from a geographical standpoint, because there's so many falls. We have tons of falls in this area. It's all made by glaciers, right? And that scar in the earth. And it's weird because sometimes you can't, like Lockport, you can kind of see the escarpment, but you can't really see it a lot. You're just driving on a flat surface, but it's there, and it makes all of those falls, and the falls basically run over this scar in the earth, right? Which is interesting, and it makes high falls and lower falls in Rochester, New York, right? And so that kind of places us in this Niagara region, this region of waterfalls that happen in this area. Also, too, the northern flowing Genesee River that flows over the escarpment, right? The scar in the earth, right? So very interesting. Rochester had the Erie Canal. St. Catharines, Ontario had the Wellington Canal. We know about the Erie Canal, the aqueduct on Broad Street. The aqueduct is still there. It used to have water flowing over it. But the base of the aqueduct is still there on the Broad Street Bridge. And so you can see what this will look like with the ships going over it on what is Broad Street, right outside the door, quite literally, right? And so here's the bridge there. You can still see that aqueduct as the basis of it. So it's like the history of transportation on this bridge, right? You have the Erie Canal, you have the rail, the subway system, right? And then you have a modern road, right, that we still use today, which is very interesting. In the St. Catherine's area, St. Catherine's has the Wellington Canal, and the Wellington Canal is so important because of what? Niagara Falls, you would fall over it, right? And so you have to have this canal to connect Lake Ontario, the lower river, if you will, to Lake Erie, the higher river where the falls are falling down into, right? And so even today, you go to St. Catherine's, the Wellington Canal is still there. You have container ships that are connecting both Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, right, through the Wellington Canal. And so both of the cities have these dynamic canals that really make the cities boom towns, right? Which is important. And last but not least, if you look at a map of Rochester and St. Catherine's, I found two maps that were made by this guy, Marcus Smith, who's a civil engineer. And you can really see, this is basically Cornhill, which they call the third ward. And you can see the different streets that Blacks would live on in Rochester, right? And also Marcus Smith, the next year, in 1852, also made a map of St. Catherine's, right? And so this is really interesting. And St. Catherine's, you notice that the Black people live in a colored community, and they build their own community on the side, if you will, of St. Catherine's, right? So they all live in one area where the Black people in Rochester live more integrated in Cornhill. It's kind of interesting that, you know, the Black people live in Cornhill today. You know, some gentrification and things of that nature have pushed them out of that area, right? And so, but it was historically, you know, an area where Blacks were at. I just want to give you guys 3 examples before I close of transnational usage, right? First of all, I'll start with Frederick Douglass. It is estimated that Frederick Douglass assisted some 400 fugitive slaves to Canada while he lived in Rochester. And so this is how Frederick Douglass is really connected to Canada. All of his newspapers, the North Star, the Frederick Douglass paper, the Douglass Monthly, had Canadian coverage and circulation. Also, his biggest foreign investors and clients were located in Canada and the larger British Empire. He made his first speech in Canada in 1851 before a crowd of some 1,200 people at St. Lawrence Hall in Toronto. He made subsequent trips to places in the British Empire such as Chatham, John, Buxton, and of course, St. Catherine's. He would make talks at St. Catherine's at the City Hall, which was the largest venue to give a talk at in St. Catherine's. Douglass also observed the British Emancipation Day holiday on August 1st. The holiday commemorated the Imperial Act of 1834, which emancipated Blacks throughout the British Empire. And so basically, you know, he said the 4th of July, to hell with it, right? In his great speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July, right? The thing is, before the Civil War, the biggest Black celebration was August 1st. And August 1st was the celebration of British emancipation. Today, we know it as Caravana. It happens the first weekend in August, right? And so that's the connection to today. Caravana, Caribbean liberation celebrations, all stem from August 1st with the British Empire abolishing slavery throughout its empire in 1834. So with all of this being said, like clearly to me, Frederick Douglass isn't transnational, right? People try to nationalize him, but he's clearly a transnational to me. You'll see, despite all of these Canadian connections of Douglass, historian Robin Winks basically says, even as a student Negro as Frederick Douglass thought that Canada was where the wild goose and the swans were paired at the end of winter and not the home of man. Huh? Like, no. Frederick Douglass knew Canada, right? Like, what are you talking about, right? And so it's very interesting how, you know, they're saying that Frederick Douglass didn't have great knowledge of Canada. He traveled there regularly I actually wrote an article called The Power of Proximity on Frederick Douglass. It basically talks about he knew the kind of transnational dynamics of where Rochester was situated, right? So it's very interesting how historians have historically kind of looked at Frederick Douglass. We can look at Harriet Tubman as well. Between 1851 and 1858, she lived in the colored village of St. Catherine's. She had brought a lot of those people, if you will, to the colored village herself, right? Which is very interesting, right? They lived in this area. A lot of people from the eastern shore of Maryland lived in this colored village in St. Catherine's. So in Rochester, Douglass, the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, and also the local AME Zion Church, all helped to move Blacks to Canada using Rochester. You can see that Douglass housed some 11 fugitives on behalf of Tubman, and then paid her passage across the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge, which I talked about before. The Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society hosted anti-slavery fairs and gathered food and clothing to send to Canada on behalf of Harriet Tubman. And the local AME Zion Church basically used, their pews in their basement to house fugitives before they went to Canada, right? So Harriet Tubman knew Rochester quite well. She had used it to transport fugitives through Rochester to St. Catherine's, where she lived for some 7 years. The other thing that's interesting about Harriet Tubman is that she would later move to Auburn, New York. But from Auburn, New York, she establishes the Fugitive Aid Society of St. Catherine's. Clearly, she's a transnational, right? So from Auburn, New York, she's still going back to St. Catherine's to establish this Fugitive Aid Society. You can see her work during the Civil War. She takes a break in the fall of 1863, and she returns back to Rochester and St. Catherine's, right? And so Harriet Tubman, you have to understand that she understands borders. She's from the border state of Maryland, right? She crosses the north-south lines, then she crosses the American-Canadian lines, and then during the Civil War, she's crossing the Union-Confederate lines. But she knows how to cross borders, right? She understands borders well, and she manipulates them, right? And so you'll see that the most cheap book on Harriet Tubman is titled, I'll just read the title, Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, a Portrait of an American Hero. She lived in Canada for 7 years. She's just not an American hero. You can't nationalize her, right? She's a transnational figure, right? And so what I did early in my career, in 2014, I wrote an article on Harriet Tubman, basically saying that Harriet Tubman is a modern person, because Harriet Tubman was global, because she goes to Canada, right? And so she kind of understands the global dynamic. It's British Canada at this particular time. She's green. She knows how to use the stars, read the landscapes, and stuff like that. And also she's gender aware. You'll see that she says that she's leaving Uncle Sam's land. She's going to the clean soil, right? And so in a sense, Harriet Tubman's like us. She's global, she's green, and she's gender aware. I mean, that's like what a modern person are. If you're not those things, you're not modern, right? We all think globally, right? We're all thinking about green, how do we be more green, recycle, do something, right? And then the gender dynamics. So the thing is that Canada, she knows that Canada has freed Black people in 1834, right? But also, what does it mean to a Black woman to understand that a queen's in charge in Canada? You think that's appealing to a Black woman? I think that might be appealing, right? Except like when Obama became president, people, outside of America could think, oh, this may be great for Black men, right? And then they get here and realize police brutality. But you have to understand what it puts in the hearts and minds of people, right? That the figurehead is a Black man. What does that mean? Is it good for Black men? Well, we found out that it wasn't that great for Black men, but the symbolic gesture, right? And so Black women are thinking like, oh, the queen's in charge, let me go there. I might not only get racial liberation, but I may get liberation because of my gender and sex as well. That's quite interesting. And so I wrote this in 2014, and then this picture came out I was like, see, I told y'all, man, she's hip, modern, and slick. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is Harriet Tubman. So in 2017, I was actually contacted by the Smithsonian to help authenticate this picture. You know, I've been sent other pictures that they thought were Harriet Tubman. I'm like, nah, that's not Harriet Tubman. But I was actually in Rochester, New York when I got this picture. My brother's a photographer, so we zoomed in on her head, and you can see the scarification from injury. A weight had hit her in her teens and stuff like that, so we're able to see the scarification. I didn't actually officially say this was Harriet Tubman until other Harriet Tubman scholars also said it was her. I didn't want to go out on a limb by myself. I'm like, let's make sure everybody thinks Harriet Tubman, right? And so we were able to authenticate the picture. We said that she was between the age of 43 and 46 at this particular picture. It helps too that her name is written at the bottom. That helped us out. Yeah, I think this is Harriet Tubman. I think it's real, right? So I was able to help authenticate this picture. And what this picture really confirmed for me was what I was saying in 2014, that she's like a modern person, right? She's sophisticated, right? And this picture just said it, because other pictures we have is when she's elderly and older, you know, stuff like that. But this one, I'm like, I told y'all she was hit. The other thing that's going on with Harriet Tubman is that she'd be put on the $20 bill in 2030. And I have actually fought against this, because Harriet Tubman, the bill is this way, that Harriet Tubman will be on the front of the $20 bill, and then Andrew Jackson will be on the back. So you have a liberator and a slaveholder on the same bill. Right? The other thing about this bill that's quite interesting is that, you know, money is not an innocent thing. What oppresses a lot of people is money, right? Student loans, those are oppressive, right? And so you have to kind of deal with and look at Harriet Tubman in a different way. The other thing is the last point in the last paragraph. In 1899, nearly 80 years old, she received $12 per month for her service as a nurse in the Civil War, and then $8 for a widow's pension for her deceased husband, her second husband. And that totals $20. I'm like, is the federal government playing around with us? What are they doing? They owed her $20 from 1865 to 1899. They didn't pay. And so I'm like, is this a joke? Like, like, what is going on with the federal government? So all the other Harriet Tubman scholars, they're all on board. Perhaps they're being paid off. You can't pay me. I'm not, I can't be bought. So I'm like, look, I don't think she should be here. Because this is a crazy bill. You got a liberator, and then she had financial trouble her entire life, so money was oppressing her. Right? I mean, she'll be there in 2030, whether we like it or not. She'll be there, and so it's very interesting. The last person I want to talk about, and before I conclude, is John Brown. John Brown's really interesting. Prior to the Harper's Ferry raid in October 1859, Brown, had already been involved in several dust-ups, if you will, to liberate Black people. You'll see in the 1856 Potawatomi Creek massacre was a part of Wellington, Kansas. He killed 5 pro-slavery supporters, and literally, he was responsible for, shooting them in the back of the head because they were pro-slavery supporters. Brown later returned to Missouri, where he attacked 2 pro-slavery homesteads and confiscated 11 persons and left them on an 82-day trek to Canada. This is all before he did the Harper's Ferry raid. He was already a fugitive when he came to Rochester to write his provincial constitution for his planned Appalachian state. He wrote that right in Rochester at Frederick Douglass's home. So, so the reason why he chooses Rochester to do this is because of his proximity to Canada. He's a fugitive, right? Good fugitives know, the law, right? They know they kill somebody in Texas, they could get executed, right? They kill somebody in New York, they might get life in prison, or other New England states. good fugitives know the laws, right? I mean, if you're a good fugitive. And so he understands that he is a fugitive already, having done those two things, right? And so he uses Rochester to write his provisional constitution at the home of Frederick Douglass on South Avenue. Right? He writes it right here. He also recruited Cheers Emperor Green, who had formerly lived in St. Catherine's. He recruits him from Frederick Douglass's house before his raid. Also, Brown is going to go to visit Harriet Tubman in St. Catherine's after he finishes his preliminary constitution, and he uses William Howard Day, who is an individual that was supposed to start a similar paper to the North Star in St. Catherine's, right? And so John Brown understands the dynamics of Rochester, New York, right? And he's using the border and using Rochester for its proximity to Canada. And so, you know, in the book, there's several transnationals that I can mention, individuals that lived in both St. Catherine's and in Rochester, New York. Reverend Thomas James is an interesting individual because he formerly owned a newspaper in Rochester called The Rights of Man. And he was actually Frederick Douglass's pastor in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And so when Frederick Douglass came back from England with the idea to start the North Star, his minister at his church was Reverend Thomas James. Reverend Thomas James, he's like, I want to start a newspaper. Reverend Thomas James had already lived in Rochester and St. Catherine's, right? He had already owned a newspaper. So he's like, oh, Frederick, you want to go to Rochester? That's a good spot. And when he gets to Rochester, his first North Star office was in the Zion AME church that he started in Rochester, New York. It was in the basement of the Zion AME church, and Rochester was his first North Star office. So clearly, this guy had told Frederick, hey, you want to go to Rochester, you want to start a paper. I already had a paper there. And I know Rochester and St. Catherine's are good locations. Reverend Thomas James moved to St. Catherine's and then moved to Rochester. He would move on to Syracuse. He would direct fugitives back to his old stomping grounds of Rochester and St. Catherine's. And then there's just like people like Isaac D. William Howard Day, and then Shields Emperor Green that joined the John Brown raid as well, had lived in both Rochester and St. Catherine. So I really kind of packed it in the book to tell this story of Rochester and St. Catherine's. And in conclusion, a couple of things. Like other towns in close proximity to the international lines of the United States, such as San Diego and El Paso to Mexico, and Detroit and Buffalo to Canada, Rochester and St. Catherine's were places that produced transnational people that were tied to the geographical space, that were not tied, if you will, to the geographical space or location per se. They were hubs of movement that attracted a diversity of cosmopolitan people. They underwent shifting migration patterns depending on the political atmosphere. They were centers for cohabitation and intermarriage, gathering places for foreign economic exchange. I'm thinking about foreign economic exchange because I lived in Washington, D.C., and one time I was trying to get some air in my tires and I had Canadian coins, and they were like, that's foreign, currency. They would exchange it for another, where that's just normal in Rochester. We see Canadian coins all the time and people exchange it. It's not a big deal. But once you get more on the interior, that becomes a problem, right? Once you get further away from the border, we look at that as this is normal to us, right? We see Ontario and Quebec tags. That's not normal. When you get down to Washington, you don't see those tags a lot, right? This is normal stuff to us that we don't kind of think of as transnational, but indeed it is, right? And so they also were sites for international conflict, and they were also places where normal national rules could be blurred or not applied at all, right? It's kind of going back to that coinage thing, right? And so in Rochester, the Rochester area, that's just normal, like whatever. Canadian coins, who cares, right? Where you get more in the interior, you're like, this is a foreign currency, we can't ship. What are you talking about? And so overall, Rochester and St. Catherine's each possess traits that were unique to borderland towns regardless of time, location, or nation that were involved. In the Niagara region, Blacks moved through and effectively occupied zones of in-betweenness, carrying signifiers of more than one identity while fully embracing none. They're in-betweenness. They're kind of oscillating between the American-Canadian borders for the best possible outcomes for themselves. That's what we do. Like, you know, you may go over to Canada and buy some stuff and come back to the border. What'd you buy? People go get medicine from Canada and come back. Like, you can't do that on the interior. We're in a unique space because of our proximity to Canada. That's what really makes Rochester dynamic. It's located in this kind of international zone where it connects to Canada. And so last but not least, although power holders have set political and national lines to gain sovereignty over given territories, ordinary Blacks, fugitive and free, emerged to reshape the borderlands of the Niagara region on their own terms, which was not intended or anticipated. As a result, Rochester and St. Catharines helped Blacks in the early 1800s to undermine statehood and to avoid oppressive conditions when necessary. This changes the conversation from a top to bottom conversation to a bottom to top conversation. Blacks in Rochester and St. Catharines did not cut themselves off from their counterparts. Instead, they embraced a common struggle that transcended location and nationality. Thank you for your time. Time for some Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely.
Questions? Sure.
Yeah, those quotes you have from Harriet Tubman, how were you able to verify them? Because a lot of people put a lot of quotes on Harriet Tubman.
Yeah, that's a good point. Harriet Tubman, there's a couple of really good sources on Harriet Tubman. Benjamin Drew in 1855 did some oral interviews in St. Catharines, and he interviewed Harriet Tubman, so that's where I got some of the quotes. And then Sarah Bradford was the first biographer of Harriet Tubman. And so I use a lot of the quotes from Sarah Bradford as well, because there has been some quotes that have been misappropriated to Harriet Tubman. So you have to be careful. And it's kind of like the mythology around Harriet Tubman. I mean, there's a lot of kind of mythology around her and in studying her. And so, yeah, you have to be careful. Yeah. So I got direct quotes from people that interviewed her. The other thing is she wasn't kind of literate, as we would say today. And so, you know, a lot of the source material comes from things like interviews and conversations with Harriet. Yes?
Professor Dan, Professor Dan, thank you very much for the presentation as well as for your scholarship. Can you tell us a little bit about why some African Americans would have chosen to come back over the border once you're in Canada, where you're free, why they would have chosen to come back over to Rochester if you're not a leader like either Douglass or Tubman. And can you give us just a little, or tell us in the book, a little thumbnail sketch of what was there a difference in terms of life for African Americans in Rochester, where we're trying to integrate and fit in the third world or wherever it might be, and in St. Catharines, where, and I saw another presentation that you've done where they decide to be not segregationists, but as you said, separatists. They built a community, they became entrepreneurs, and here in Rochester, you know, fellow Rochesterians, we haven't had quite that kind of approach to things in terms of life for African Americans.
Yeah, those are two very good questions. Number one, the reason why people came back, it was for like economic reasons. I'm thinking of Reverend Logan. Reverend Logan went to he escaped from Tennessee and then went to St. Catharines first. And then he went to Rochester, New York, and it was really to work at the Rochester House Hotels, a prominent hotel in downtown Rochester that he went to work at. And so he wasn't making as much money in St. Catherine's, and so he came to Rochester. The thing is, though, is that Blacks felt quite comfortable in Rochester because of its proximity to Canada. And that's why I kind of deal with them. I call them Black borderlanders, because they understand when you're close enough that you can get out, that there's an escape hatch, right? And that's what John Brown was doing too. He was planning a rebellion on the United States. Where did he plan it? On South Avenue at Frederick Douglass' house, because he knew he can get out, right? He's a good fugitive. You stay just close enough to the border and you can get out. Buffalo, you can't stay in because there's too many people around, and Syracuse is too far. So Rochester occupies this great space where people felt comfortable. And that's like kind of hard to explain because, you know, if I got out, I don't think I would come back. Like, look, I'm in Canada. I'm there, I'm moving. I don't care if I don't got a good job or not, I'll make it work. But these people were so comfortable with the border and the borderlands that they felt that they could get out. There's boats leaving on a regular basis, ships leaving on a regular basis, so they don't feel troubled by that. Now, the question you asked about the colored village versus kind of living in the third ward, which is Cornhill today, is that in St. Catharines, this is why I really kind of love the people of St. Catharines, because they build their own Black community in St. Catharines. And literally, when they go to like integrate the schools, they vote not to integrate the schools. They're like, no, we have our own Black schools. All we want is the tax money. Just, we'll teach our own kids, right? Which was interesting. And so for me, you know, I went to Howard University, and so I kind of believed in Black institutions and building Black, right? And so I really liked the colored village because, you know, when Black people needed a job, they got jobs, you know, amongst themselves. They didn't have to wait on white people for a job. They had jobs in the community, right? So I kind of liked the Black kind of nationalist kind of creed that they had in the colored village versus in Rochester, the Black people were all about integrating the schools, you know, integrating the economies and stuff like that, which makes sense, right? That's the way things really should be. But if they're not going to be that way, if you're going to get harmed by doing that, I like what the people in St. Catharines did, right? They had their own community. They felt safe there. They had their own businesses, their own enterprises and stuff like that. And I felt that was really dynamic. And in the last point that you bring up, you know, this is not segregation because they could have lived in other parts of St. Catharines if they wanted to. But it was more separation. They chose to live there because they felt comfortable and they had all of these like good things that were going on in this community. So they chose that life, which was very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes.
What eventually happened to the colored village? I mean, after freedom?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the colored village, it's still there, and there's remnants of the colored village. It's a more integrated community now. The thing is, after the Civil War, some 60 to 65,000 Blacks go to Canada, some 30 to 35,000 Blacks go to Canada before the Civil War. Half of them come back after the Civil War. Yeah. And so once the United States abolishes slavery, they come back, right? And so they come back across the border. And so that leaves Canada with very few Blacks, some 15,000 Blacks left, if you will, after that exodus back to the United States. And so today, you know, in Canada, most of the Black people that, you know, exist there are from the Caribbean, from Africa and stuff like that. There's very few descendants of African Americans still left in Canada. And so that'll tell you, though, that they wanted to stay in the American South and they wanted to stay in the United States amongst their friends and family. But they had to go to Canada because of slavery, right? And because of slave catchers and stuff like that. I really like what Frederick Douglass says. He says anything south of the Canadian border is the South. Because you can get caught by either the slavery or you can get caught by the slave catchers. How do you want it? So get to Canada. Get out of here, right? Anything south of the Canadian border was indeed, in a sense, the South. Right? It's very dangerous for Black people. Yes.
This is kind of like a common way, but the passage you're talking about from slave going from Rochester to Canada. I remember taking a trip with my son when he was very young, and we took a trip down 104 with this organization where they talked about the slaves came in these homes and farms, and they took us in and we actually saw still people had these quarters underground these farms where slaves came to travel down 104 to Canada.
Yeah, there is remnants of the Underground Railroad. There's a lot of work being done to really officially say that these were sites. So there are some kind of means we can go through to make sure that they were Underground Railroad sites. I should mention an article I wrote. It's called "The Underground Railroad as Afrofuturism." And so if you look at this area of Rochester, it is a dynamic area. And I say that because Black people are futurists because they're using the most modern technology to get to freedom. They're using trains to go to Canada over a suspension bridge, right? I mean, that's pretty futuristic. The other thing that you have to understand about slaves is that, they have to envision that there's, like, if you were to tell them that there's free Black people in Rochester and they're enslaved in the Carolinas, that's like the future. And when you get to Rochester, you have time travel in a sense, right? Like with the world, right? And two, Black people were using these modern technologies, right? The suspension bridges, the railroads, right? And also they're using things like the North Star to follow and stuff like that. That's really futuristic, right? And they have, in a sense, time travel. When they got to like a place like New York City, you're from the Carolinas, it's like you're in the future. I mean, people today still in like Times Square, they're looking up, like, oh my God, like, right? You know what I mean? Because in a sense, like, it's like, wow, these buildings, the subway, like, it's so dynamic. And so I really categorize Blacks as Afrofuturists, right? They have to envision a free future. And then when they get to Canada, right, they're able to kind of live out this Black liberation that they had envisioned. And they're using the most modern technology. I'll give you one last example. Henry Box Brown, he mailed himself from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia. Express mail had just came out. He literally Amazoned himself to freedom. He harnessed the most modern technology. And then you talk about thinking outside of the box. He was in the box, right? But thinking outside, that's futuristic. Express mail had just came out. He mailed himself to freedom. I mean, that's futuristic. And Frederick Douglass was mad at him because he was like, do you know how many, he wrote a narrative and told what he did. Frederick Douglass was like, you know how many people could have mailed themselves? Like, why are you telling this? Like, this is the Underground Railroad now, bro. Why you do that? So, I mean, that's futuristic. He harnessed the most modern technology, right, to get to freedom. That's what you want. I'll take a spaceship to freedom, and that's what I gotta do, right? You mean, so the trains, think about, and so the way that we look at Black enslaved people is we look at them as kind of like low tech. But I talked about in this article, the Black inner geek, that Black people got to expose how smart they are when they ran away. Because in slavery, they would be beat if you know about the North, like what? Like, you know what I mean? You would be beat for that, right? If you showed how smart you were, you would get in trouble. So what the Underground Railroad did was expose the Black inner geek. These people were smart. And so the other thing is like, the white people in the South, they actually believe their own mythology because they're like, these Black people are too stupid to get to Canada. It must be those Yankees or abolitionists. No, Black people know how to get to Canada. Watch. They don't need no abolitionists or Yankees and stuff. So they were blaming on the white people how Black people got to Canada. Nah, they know what they're doing. Right? They know what they're doing. And so I look at Black enslaved people as Afrofuturists that use the Underground Railroad. They're using the most modern technology. They're exposing the Black community. And so I would suggest, like, if one, the book too, but one article that's on my website as well, danj.broyld.com, and it'll show you all of my articles, but the Underground Railroad as Afrofuturists. you have to read, this is like revolutionary stuff, because it really transfers these Black people. And I mean, like the stuff they were doing, rubbing pine spruce on the bottom of their shoes to, you know, throw off the dogs, right? That's fugitive technology. It's fugitive technology. How do you get free? Just fugitive tech to me, like, it makes sense. These people are Afro-futurists.
Why was Canada such a place, you know, of freedom in comparison to the United States? And, you know, there's always like internations and you know, things that are set in place. How come Canada was this place where we could go?
That's a great question, Steve. So the thing is about British Canada and about the British in general is they kind of understand what's kind of coming around the curve in terms of liberation. And so Black people learned through the American Revolution and also through the War of 1812 that the British are better than the Americans, right? So literally Black people fight for the British and they get land in Canada for fighting for the British and they get their freedom. And so Black people learn that the British are better than the Americans, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? If you're gonna fight the Americans, oh, we like you, right? And so they recognize that. The other thing that the British do is that they liberate slaves with the Imperial Act of 1834, but they also are the #1 buyers of Southern-made slave cotton. So they liberate their slaves, right? But they're still buying products for their industrial revolution from the American South. So they realize we don't need our own slaves. We just get cotton from the American South. And so the British are smart in that way. They're like, you got to be kind of careful with the British because they're kind of ahead of the curve, right? They understand what's coming, right? That people need to be all wage workers, right? So they get rid of slavery, but they're still getting the product that they need. They're still getting cotton. They're the #1 buyers of that cotton coming from the American South made by slaves. So don't look at them as too liberal or liberating, because they're not. They just realize that they can try to, you know, get the kind of stamp of slavery off of their empire, right? And look like the liberators and stuff like that while they're still buying that cotton. So they just find other means, right? To do what they need to do. And so the British, you got, you know, caution, you know, because, you know, sometimes it looks like they're liberal, but they'll be doing kind of other things on the other side that are as repressive and oppressive as well. So careful. But, you know, Canada, I mean, for all intents and purposes, when Black people got there, the British didn't return them to the United States. There were slave owners that tried to petition the British government to get their slaves back out of Canada. And the British, you know, they relented on like 2 occasions, but they never really, you know, once you got to Canada, you're generally free. So Black people understood that, right? And they used those imperial conflicts against, you know, the 2 imperialists, if you will, the British and the Americans, against one another for the best possible outcomes for their own liberation. So Black people are just kind of using them to, yeah, y'all fight, you know, y'all talk about we're gonna get free, right, in Canada. Right? So it's very interesting. Yeah.
So on your website and the video, you were talking about the chapters. You're saying that the Rochester chapter was bleak.
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by that?
So the thing about Rochester is that the Black community didn't do as well as the Black community in St. Catherine's did. This is partly because of the national laws, right? That the British had, you know, outlawed slavery and stuff like that. So it was always this issue in Rochester of like getting caught by slave catchers, right? And this always didn't allow a more stable community in Rochester. The other thing I think was interesting about Rochester is that, you know, the whole integration thing. They probably would have just did well to say, hey, we have our own area, and we're doing our own thing. But they kept, you know, trying to integrate the schools. And even when like Frederick Douglass helped to integrate the schools, you know, it didn't quite work out for Black people that well, right? And so, you know, I really like what the Black people in St. Catherine's did. And there's primary documents that say, you know, when people from Rochester went to St. Catherine's, they're like, these Black people are different. perhaps we should have did what they did, right? You know what I mean? So they're looking at them like, wow. And so yes, it was bleak in Rochester, but that's only because of comparing it to St. Catherine's. When you compare Rochester to Buffalo or Syracuse, it's great. Rochester, as a community in the American context, is doing okay. But when you start to look internationally at like a St. Catherine's, that's when you say that, oh, this community is not doing as well. So.
How long did it take you to do this book, and how did you do it?
Oh, sure. It took over 10 years basically to produce this book. This was actually my dissertation. My dissertation from Howard University. I finished in 2011, and so it took some time to kind of do extra research and stuff like that. Historians, it's a long game. It takes us years to produce books. My next book will be more like on some essays. There'll be more essays and less primary source based. So this is all primary sources. This is all newspapers. I mean, I looked at newspapers from, the 1820s, 1830s and stuff like that. This is some old stuff, right? And so to be able to kind of recover these stories. Yes.
Yeah, the question that I have is,
Yes.
What you mentioned, the dynamic that Rochester had toward the race, during the race toward freedom, given that aspect of the time, and St. Catharine also, what changed? Because when you look today, maybe a few years ago, and also in Toronto, St. Catharine is known as one of the most racist towns in that city, and Rochester also is known for its racism. What changed? Because I would think the role that they play towards freedom, it will not be as dense as it is today. What do you think changed, or it has always been this way?
Particularly about St. Catherine's, that wave of Blacks leaving during and after the Civil War, it was just like kind of an exodus, out of St. Catherine's. The other thing is about Canada. Canada is really diverse in the cities, and then the outskirts are not as diverse. And so, like, say for example, Toronto, it's like in 2018, I look, and Toronto was 51% foreigners. There's more foreigners in Toronto than there actually is Canadians. I mean, that's in some areas, it's like 75% foreigners in Canada, or in Toronto. And so the cities in Canada are quite diverse. It's when you get on the outskirts, St. Catherine's, in between, Niagara Falls and Toronto is St. Catherine's, right? And it's just not as diverse. But generally in the cities, you'll have no problems. When you get on the outskirts, then you might run into some things, right? But that's kind of like in the United States, in the metropoles, you're cool, right? It's cool, like diversity, you already fine. It's when you get on the outskirts. And it can be more intense in parts of Canada, because they look at, in Canada, they actually need people to come in, foreigners to come in, because they can't even maintain their economy without foreigners coming in, right? And so some of some Canadians, particularly white Canadians, look at this as an actual threat. So, but yeah, it doesn't have the dynamics that it once had. So, it's Mike.
Did some free Blacks become slave owners? And were they in Buffalo? Did they cause wrench or did they put a wrench in the plans of like underground railroad and things like that? Because there were Blacks in the South, but were there?
Black slave owners, not really. Yeah. In terms of Buffalo, yeah, I mean, Buffalo was just, it was kind of polluted by slave catchers, right? It was just so many there, because they knew once they got the British Canada, it was over. And so they would try to congregate by the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge, the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, stuff like that. They would congregate in those areas. Also, ships and stuff like that. They're trying to kind of develop almost like checkpoints to, see who's on the ships and stuff. So the slave catchers were really congregating in that area. So, yeah.
So earlier you posted a picture of Harriet Tubman, but more in a, refined look, she was quote unquote dolled up.
Mhm.
How much of, the image of her working and helping people to become free, with the head wrap on and, she was in her work clothes, I guess you could say. And then the picture you showed, she was more, hanging out, or, being a quote unquote normal person. How much was she able to be a normal person? And that image that you presented of her, how much of her, like what percentage of her life was she operating in that way?
See, that's a great question, because you have to understand that, our material culture says something about who we are. Enslaved people that were field hands, it was very hard for them to run away because their clothes were ragged, right? And so you knew that that's like a fugitive, right? And so even Frederick Douglass, when he ran away from Maryland, his wife, Anna Douglass, she got him sailor's clothes, right? So clothes matter in what you had on. It would kind of be like if you guys went outside and you guys see somebody in an orange onesie or a black and white, striped shirt, you'd be like, I'm calling the authorities, right? Like this person's like clearly just ran away from jail. Like generally people don't walk around in orange onesies. So that says who you are, basically. Like if you have an orange onesie on, like I'm gonna be a little suspect. Like, I'm gonna be a little suspect. And so that's the thing. It would give them away, and that's why it was so hard for field hands, if you will, to kind of run away because of their clothes. Also because of the way they spoke the English language, right? They're speaking in the Black vernacular, right? And so this is why, the people that actually made it to the American North, they occupied in some ways, and some historians would say that they were kind of privileged slaves. You have to understand that even in slavery, there is a class system. Right? So the people that worked in the house, they spoke better, they dressed better, and so that was easier for them to run away because they could move to the American North as a free person. You were a field hand, you talked a certain way, your clothes, they know you're not free. That's an orange ones. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, we know who you are. We're calling the authorities, right? And so material culture actually helps you. I mean, when somebody pulls up in a Mercedes and somebody pulls up in a, a Chevy, the material culture kind of tells you something, right? Even rich people drive Chevys, but the fact that they pulled up in this Mercedes and they want you to see them, the material culture is telling you something about. And so the thing is, and this is because I teach material culture too in college, I teach people how to kind of read material, right? When you go in a room, what are you looking at, right? The other thing that you have to understand is that we generally learn through reading and writing, but like, what can you learn from somebody's items? And so that's another kind of way that historians are working. We've read all of Frederick Douglass' stuff. Now we're going into his house in Washington, D.C., and we're saying, his house in Anacostia, Washington, D.C., which is very interesting because it was just like the house on South Avenue, which overlooked the entire city. If you guys ever been to his house in Washington, it overlooks the Capitol Rotunda. It's absolutely beautiful. Frederick Douglass, he owned great property.
A lot of stairs.
Yeah, a lot of stairs. Yeah, absolutely. So, beautiful at the top, right? Like just, it overlooks the entire, it's the best view of Washington, D.C., I'm telling you. It's the best view. It's the best view.
Cedar Hill.
Yeah, Cedar Hill, yep, Cedar Hill. The sage of Anacostia, yep. And so, material means something, and you can actually read it. We just think that kind of learning comes through like reading and writing, but you have to learn how to dissect objects. So I think you can do that quite well, being into vintage, furniture. So you can read objects, right? And that helps, right? That's an application that we can use for history as well.
So, Professor Ian, does borderland blacks before other areas of your scholarship help us to understand the contributions of African-American women who weren't Harriet Tubman? I mean, all along you had sisters doing some good stuff here that we hardly hear anything about. So, for instance, here in Rochester, there would have been Anna Murray Douglas and other women, although we don't know very well. I certainly don't know very much at all about them. So we love Harriet Tubman, but is there someone, you or others, who can help us with the contributions of African-American women who are holding on the fort, who are right there supporting the men that are being highlighted here?
Yeah, and so there's a particular book that you should probably look at. This is one of my favorite historians, Kelly Jackson Carter, and her book is called Force and Freedom. And she talks about these kind of silent, I think she called them silent revolutionaries that are really helping to liberate Black people. She talks about in Douglas, and she talks about the wife of Jeremiah Logan as well, and some of these individuals that are kind of working behind the scenes to make sure that Black liberation happens. For Frederick Douglass is only in Rochester for about 5 months of the year. He's usually snowed in Rochester, he has to be here, right? But the rest of the time, it's really his wife and kids that are helping Black fugitives to get to Canada, right? Though he gets the credit, it's really his wife, like, right? And so the same thing with Reverend Logan, he was out of town most of the time, right? So his wife was the one who was, taking the fugitives that they're knocking on the door late at night, right? So these Black women are absolutely, key to Black liberation. The last thing, and is that my time?
Okay, we got there.
Okay, we got time. I just want to talk about the cover of the book too. This picture is from the Rick Bell collection held at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario. These pictures were found, I believe, in 2011. These pictures were found in an attic in St. Catharines. In 2011 is the year I finished my dissertation, and it just seemed like idyllic that these pictures were found. And so we don't know who these two women are. But, they have Niagara Falls at their back. And I just thought it was so important to kind of push for Black women. These images are so rare. They're actually on a tintype photograph, and they used to print on tin. They tried glass, and then, Rochester and, Eastman found out that film was the best thing to print on, right? And so these are tintypes. And I just thought it was so important to put these Black women on the cover of the book because these images are just dynamic. They're so rare. They're so rare to have these images. So if you're ever in St. Catharines, Brock University, you can go up and see the whole collection of these tintypes. They're also online. You look at the Rick Bell collection online. Just beautiful, beautiful images.
I mean, to ask so many questions with such an interesting topic. What is your study of this period? I mean, I'm not sure exactly how far back you go, or if you just stay in a particular time frame, but you're talking a lot about the 1800s, and you seem very passionate about learning about this particular time. Why are you so passionate? And also, does your studies of that particular period influence the way you look at the world now?
That's a very good question. The reason why I wrote this book is because I believe I am a borderland Black. Absolutely. And that's why I started out the conversation as I started it out by telling my history of living in the borderlands. And so really, this book is quite earnest. I feel like I have lived this, right? I mean, literally, I told you guys I went to Canada, so I didn't know if I was American or Canadian. So my identity, like being in Rochester, I didn't even know what I was. Like, are we American? Why are we in Canada all the time? And my dad literally tells me I was made in Canada. Like, what is it? That come with dual citizenship? I'll take it. Like, I get out of here. But I mean, that's how much they were in Canada. All of my pictures we were always in Canada. And in a sense, that makes my kind of international global view quite different than other Americans because I had access to Canada. There's so many when you go to Niagara Falls, there's people from around the world there, like just trying to get a view, like, yo, what's up? Like, let's see these falls, right? And so for me, that made me a globalist, like right away. Right? You have to understand too that it's British Canada, so the rules are, Canada is still part of the British Empire. Part of the reason why they're still part of the British Empire is because they're afraid of their neighbors to the south, right? And so they're like, if we ever get in the dust up with America, at least we got the empire to help us out, right? And so they stay a part of the empire because of that, right? And so in a sense, Canada is this international place. I just said, like Toronto, 51% foreign. So I mean, it's just so international. So yes, that has like weight on me growing up in this area, right? And being a borderland Black, I really look at people in Rochester as just borderland people that really understand the dynamics of Canada and the internationalism that comes with it. And it gives us a different type of global perspective that makes us unique as Americans, if you will.
Well, what's the size of St. Catharine?
The size of St. Catharine, that's a great question. I'll answer twofold. During this time period, Rochester and St. Catharine's both had a Black population of 700 people. And I say 700 people kind of, some 700 people, approximately 700 people, because it's a borderland. So it's kind of like trying to, count the sand on the beach. It changes every minute, every hour. Like these people are in and out, right? And so it's really, really quite dynamic. The type of movement that's happening in this borderlands. At this particular time that I'm writing about, the size of Rochester. Rochester was actually bigger than Toronto at this time. I think it's 100,000 people by 1860. And St. Catharine's is significantly smaller. I believe it was like 45,000 people, but still has a population of 700. It was over 100,000 by 1860.
Did you find out why your family went to Toronto so much? Were you connected to those Blacks here?
No, we weren't. The reason why we went to Canada so much, I found out, was because my dad is cheap. It really was cheaper. You got 4 kids. Like, and that's what I mean by using the board. We went school shopping there, right? And then the exchange rate was much cheaper. So we took, vacations at Canada Wonderland because it was cheap. It's cheap. You gotta people on the borders can do that. We can save money by going again. Can we go to Canada for gas? Probably wouldn't be worth the trip. But you know what I mean? Like, yo, if you can do that, right? If I was in Niagara Falls, I would cross the border. I'd be like, I'm going to get some cheaper gas, right? You can save, right? And so that's why we went to Canada so much, I think, because my dad was cheap. My dad was like, hey, you can your money. Yeah, I'm thinking something deep. No, it's not deep. It's money. Right? But you have to understand, even like, say for example, when I go to Canada, I kind of up the hotel I stay in because I know that the American dollar is more, right? So I act differently because it's Canada, it's cheaper. So why not live like a king, right? At least for a night or two in my expensive, Toronto hotel, right? Why not? They change it. So that's what made it so dynamic. And that's why I kind of, I really don't like after 9/11 the passport and the enhanced license because it becomes an economic barrier. Or the reason why my dad went to Canada, because it wasn't an economic barrier. They literally used to just kind of wave us through. Like, hey, okay, cool, come through, right? But now it's like, gotta get scanned and then stop in the office and this, that, and the next. And so really it was a kind of economic thing where Black families in Rochester understood that they could, save some money and stuff like that. And they too kind of be exposed to something a little different.
I think also the cultural, we're probably traveling with you guys because you could go over, you could go to Caravana, you could go to the theater, there were all sorts of things. It was a thriving community that after 9/11 and COVID, things maybe they have changed, but a lot of people from Rochester spent time in Ontario.
Yeah, the other thing is too, from living I lived in Connecticut for 7 years, and like the thing is to me, you know, like Rochester is like 6 to 8 hours away from New York City. It's about 2 to 3 to Toronto. And so really, you know, I'm more of like a Canadian than a New Yorker. Like New York is far away, like Toronto's close. So where do we kind of spend time? If you want to go to a major metropolis, go to Toronto, right? And, you know,
They're nice.
New York City's far. Like, you know, it literally is. It's a drive, it's a haul, but to get to Canada, you're like, oh, it's an hour, you know, you cross the border. So the thing is, you know, you have to understand that what makes Western New York dynamic is this proximity to Canada. We're more, I really think that, you know, we're like New York Staters and New Yorkers are New Yorkers, right? But we're like, you know, more Canadian than this. And people look at us, oh, you guys are near Canada, right? You guys are out by Canada, right? And so, you know, that's the kind of dynamic that I think Rochesterians have to kind of understand more, is that really what makes this dynamic is, because when I lived in Connecticut, you know, Connecticut's super close to New York City, right? And people in Connecticut are more New Yorkers than we are, in the sense we're close to Canada, they're close to New York, right? And so you have to understand those dynamics, right? And so, you know, while we're a part of New York, and I like saying I'm a part of New York State, but really I'm like Canadian. Like, you know what I mean? We're like, we're kind of, you know, we're off in this, you know, Western New York part, right? We're out far and away from New York City, right? And so I think that that's important to kind of recognize.
Two comments I wanted to add. To your point, there's a book written by another one of our Rochester speakers, Laura Warren Hill, Strike the Hammer, and there was a section there where she spoke about some of the lesser known contributions of some of the women behind some of these figures, not so much this time period, but a little further up, but that's something that still might be of interest to you, but lesser known women behind this period. And then I also wanted to read a comment from Zoom, because we do have a Zoom audience as well. Oh, right. So we had a comment.
Can't forget them.
Yeah, we can't forget our Zoom audience. So I wanted to read their comment as well. She said, "Hi, Dan, this is Christine, and I love how you contextualize the story and help me see Rochester in new ways. One of my questions is, do we know the approximate percentage of fugitives who entered Canada from Rochester by ship versus land route?"
That's a great question. We don't, and because it's underground railroad is the reason why we don't. It's really hard to get at these sources and to know percentiles. And this is the reason why, like, African American history is so different, because the way we source material is just different, and we don't have the numbers. Sometimes people want these numbers, and sometimes, you know, early Black scholars were criticized for not having the numbers, or, you know, I can kind of make a percentage if I wanted to kind of estimate and stuff like that. But we just don't have those numbers. I will say that I think that there's more people taking ships, but we can't, you know, get kind of solid numbers on that. I think the fact of the matter is kind of explaining the various ways that they get there by land, you know, by these bridges, and using the ships. But in terms of percentages, I wouldn't even kind of dare to guess.